Our screening this week is a movie that many of you are probably familiar with, and some of you maybe have seen more than once over the course of your lifetime, and that, of course, is The Wizard of Oz. The Wizard of Oz is a movie that most Americans have seen at least once in their life by the time they get to be college age. It is also one of just a few rather old movies that most Americans have seen. The movie is from 1939, which is from right in the heart of the period of film history called the Classical Hollywood era, or the Classical Hollywood cinema. It is an American film and is one of the classic examples of a Hollywood movie from the classical era of movie history. It was made by a director named Victor Fleming, but also sort of equally is an example of the MGM studio. The credited director for the movie, in other words, the name that you'll see in the credits as being directed by, is a man named Victor Fleming. And he was, in fact, the director or the creative decision maker on much of the movie. There were three other directors who all worked, as Fleming did, for the MGM movie studio in the late 1930s, who also directed parts of the pre-production or production of The Wizard of Oz. You don't need to worry about remembering or knowing the names of these directors, but you should know and have a sense of the idea that during the classical Hollywood period of the 1930s and 1940s, the movie studios had a great deal of control over the directors. The movie directors of that era did not have the same kind of creative control over their movies as movie directors do today. Movie directors were basically uh, employees of the movie studios, and the producers and studio chiefs of the studios could and often did assign and reassign directors as they saw fit. And so this sort of history, in terms of the production of The Wizard of Oz, in terms of its directors, makes it a true product of the studio system. We're going to be studying the studio system in much more detail later on in the semester in our unit on film history. But for now, just realize that the studio system was a system in which films were sort of made in assembly line fashion. Uh, each studio had departments for every aspect of movie making: a lighting department, a costume design and creation department, a writing department where staffs of screenwriters were employed, a directing staff, editors, sound recorders, and mixers. And movies during this era, in the 1930s and 1940s, were made in what could be called an assembly line fashion. Much like other sorts of consumer products, using the assembly line concept, which in the 1930s was still a fairly new concept. It was only a couple of decades before that that the assembly line form of manufacturing was first perfected by, among others, Henry Ford in the making of automobiles. And so during this era, this was sort of the way in which movies were made as well. In an assembly line fashion in which all of the workers and all of the different departments of a movie were sort of interchangeable with one another. And The Wizard of Oz is one of the quintessential examples of a movie made under this studio assembly line sort of system. The star of the movie, of course, is Judy Garland, pictured in the upper left here. Judy Garland was an actress who started out as a teenage actress. She was still in her teens when she starred in The Wizard of Oz. She also was right around the same time in a series of movies with another teenage actor named Mickey Rooney, uh, in which they played a couple of teenage characters. The other three actors that you see pictured here are the three actors playing uh, Dorothy's three companions that she encounters in Oz. And of course, each of these companions that she goes on her travels in Oz with were sort of counterparts of farmhands from her real life back in Kansas. We have Ray Bolger in the upper right, who played Hunk in the farmyard in Kansas, and Scarecrow in Oz. Bert Lahr in the lower left, who played Zeke in the Kansas portion of the film, and the Cowardly Lion in Oz. Jack Haley in the lower right, who played the farmhand Hickory and Tin Man in the Land of Oz. And not pictured here is the actor Frank Morgan, who played in the Kansas portion Professor Marvel, who Dorothy runs into as she's trying to run away from home, and who shows up in Dorothy's dream in Oz as the Wizard of Oz himself, or at least the person who's trying to pose as the Wizard of Oz. Now, all of these actors in the studio era in which The Wizard of Oz was made would have been contract actors, meaning that they all had long term contracts with the studio for which they worked, in this case MGM. And all of the films that they made were made for the MGM studio, and the studio had the ability and exercised the ability to make decisions as to what movies they were going to appear in, what their roles were going to be in those movies, and so forth. And that system of actors being under contract and being assigned their roles by the studio is another part of the assembly line system that was part of movie making in the studio era, or the classical Hollywood years of the 1930s and 1940s. In terms of the story of Wizard of Oz, the movie has what is called a framing device. This is found in quite a few films, even many that still come out today and have come out in recent years, where there's a central portion of the story, really the bulk of the film, that is framed by an opening sequence and an ending sequence that are in some way separate from that central part of the movie that makes up the bulk of the length of the movie. Sometimes it's geographical in nature. Probably more often it is temporal in nature, meaning related to time, such as the central portion of the movie is a flashback, with the opening and ending sequences being, bracketing that flashback. In the case of The Wizard of Oz, the framing device is a matter of Dorothy having a dream. We see her in Kansas. She is knocked out, so to speak, by the tornado, and then we have her whole story in Oz, and at the end, it comes back to the Kansas locale of the movie, and that serves as a framing sequence. Of course, the other aspect of the framing sequence in The Wizard of Oz is that the bracketing or the framing sequences are in black and white, sort of a sepia-toned black and white, and the central portion that takes place in Oz is in Technicolor. Now, the sort of Technicolor, which is just a bright, vibrant color that was the result of the kind of movie film used in the 1930s, that was pretty rare in that time period. It existed, it obviously is there in Wizard of Oz, and there were other films made in color in the late 1930s, but color was sort of a special thing, sort of like 3D movies in our day now. something that was reserved only for special movies that had special treatment and were thought to be the blockbuster sort of movies. The story in Wizard of Oz is, in part, about Dorothy's journey, both her physical journey following the yellow brick road in Oz, as well as her symbolic or figurative journey. And we can talk about where is Dorothy as a character at the start of the movie and where is she at the end in a symbolic sense. Where has she arrived at the end of the movie that she hadn't been at the beginning of the movie in a figurative sense. And this is, of course, related to what we can talk about in terms of themes of the movie. Wizard of Oz is a movie that fits into both the fantasy genre and the musical genre, and we'll talk about genres in movies in quite a bit of depth towards the end of the semester. But for now, just know that this is a film that represents the best elements of both of these genres. The fantasy genre, in which there's fantastical lands and fantastical creatures and fantastical things that happen to characters, as well as the musical genre, in which there are very elaborate production numbers involving singing and dancing and related to that are related to the story that's being told. And the production values of The Wizard of Oz, as both a fantasy and as a musical, represent the full capabilities of the studio system. As I said in the previous slide, sort of a quintessential film representing the Hollywood studio system of the classical Hollywood era. So, what do I want you to watch for as you're watching Wizard of Oz? You have probably seen Wizard of Oz before, and so you don't, even though I say here I want you to watch for story elements, and I do, you don't have to watch for story elements the way that you would in a movie that you haven't seen before. If you happen not to have seen it, of course, you do need to pay attention just to what happens in the movie to understand the plot and so forth. But more likely, if you are a person who has seen it before, you can watch those elements in a little different way. Knowing sort of how the story goes and what happens in terms of the plot, you can pay a little bit more attention to how the characters interact, how the characters are portrayed on film, and try and tease out some of those elements as to what the theme or potential themes of the movie are. Because talking about the themes of The Wizard of Oz is going to be part of our follow-up activities after you're done with the screening. Another thing I would like you to do is to see if you can see any of the seams of the production process. That's sort of an elusive idea, but see if you can notice any hints or traces of how the movie was made, evidence of the production process, which could be just paying attention to what the sets and the backdrops look like. Every single frame of The Wizard of Oz was shot in a sound stage. There wasn't any of it that was shot out of doors, even those sequences that are supposed to have taken place out of doors in Kansas or the Land of Oz. So you can kind of look for that in the backgrounds and see how these supposedly exterior scenes were actually shot on sound stages. You can look at some of the special effects and kind of try and figure out how those were created. Uh, the staging and blocking of musical numbers and that sort of thing. Costumes, there's very elaborate costumes on the characters. Pay attention to those. Any kind of evidence that you can see in the movie of the production process and just appreciate that based on what you've learned this week in terms of the production process and the different things that go into that process. particularly if there are some things that you wonder how they were created. You can take note of those, and perhaps we can have some discussion on that after you're done screening the film.